He came to find a stolen iron post and spotted an Apache mother and her baby about to die. In saving them, he inherits a secret that could ignite a war by sunrise. The canyon wind was a file, sharpening the edges of the silence. Elias Thorne lay flat on the sun-scorched rock, the grit pressing into his cheek. Through his field glass, he watched the heat shimmer rise from the valley floor 200 feet below. For 3 days, he had tracked them, not by their hoofprints, but by their carelessness. A discarded ration tin, a hastily extinguished fire, the snapped branch of a palo verde tree. Amateurs, but they were amateurs working for a man who was not. Colonel Gideon Shaw, a man who bought land with contracts when he could, and with blood when he couldn't. Elias wasn't tracking men, not yet. He was tracking a survey marker, a simple iron post that proved this sliver of land, with its year-round spring, belonged to the Double R Ranch, not to Shaw's expanding empire. The marker was his job. $100 silver to find it and report its theft to the territorial marshal. Simple. He adjusted the focus on the glass, sweeping past the cluster of riders below. 4 of them, their horses tied loosely to a scrub oak. They weren't looking for him. Their attention was fixed on a small alcove in the rock face, a place where the shadows gathered deep and cool. And then he saw her, an Apache woman, pressed back into the rock, her body a shield for the small bundle tied to a cradle board at her side. She held a knife, its blade a sliver of defiant light. She was cornered, her face a mask of resolute terror. Shaw's men were laughing, taking their time, enjoying the sport. The glint of the stolen survey marker was plain to see, tied with rough twine to one of their saddles. His job was done. He had found it. All he had to do was back away, ride the 50 miles to Prescott, and collect his pay. The woman was not his concern. This was not his fight. He had learned long ago that the only way to survive in this land was to tend your own fire. He started to slide back from the ledge, the sharp rock scraping his shirt. But he paused. He saw the way the woman's eyes darted, not in panic, but in calculation, assessing the terrain, the distance between the men, the placement of their rifles in their saddle scabbards. He saw the way her hand rested on the cradle board, a gesture of fierce, silent promise. It reminded him of another time, another woman, another debt left unpaid, a ghost that rode with him on the long, empty trails. He let out a slow, quiet breath, the sound lost in the wind. Damn it all. He checked the load in his Winchester. 7 rounds. He had another 20 in his saddlebag. His Colt held 6. Enough for this, maybe. He wasn't a hero. He was a pathfinder, a man who read the land and the people on it. And what he read below was a story that was about to end badly. He could not let that happen. His jaw tightened. The $100 was forfeit. The simple job had just become complicated. He levered around into the chamber, the metallic snick, a final, irrevocable decision. He rose from the ledge, his silhouette a stark, lonely figure against the brassy sky. The first shot was not aimed at a man. It was aimed at the rock face, a foot above the loudest of the riders. The bullet screamed off the stone, the ricochet a hornet's buzz that sent them diving for cover. The hunt was over. The fight had begun. The second shot was tactical. It punched through the leather of a canteen, sending a precious stream of water arcing into the dust. Panic was a better weapon than a clean kill. While Shaw's men scrambled, trying to pinpoint his position on the rimrock, Elias was already moving, sliding down a steep scree slope, using a narrow game trail he'd noted earlier. He moved with a controlled, fluid economy, his boots finding purchase where there seemed to be none. He was no longer a sniper. He was an infantryman, changing his angle of attack. The woman saw it. As 2 of the men fired blindly up at the ledge he'd just vacated, she seized the moment. She didn't run. She charged, a blur of motion, the knife held low. She went not for the men, but for their horses. With 2 quick, savage slashes, she cut the reins of the nearest mounts. The terrified animals screamed and bolted, adding to the chaos. Elias reached the valley floor, 50 yards from the melee, concealed behind a cluster of barrel cactus. He raised the Winchester. A man had drawn a bead on the woman. Elias fired. The man grunted, clutching a shattered shoulder as his rifle tumbled into the dirt. One down. The others, realizing they were being attacked from 2 directions, made their choice. They were hired guns, not soldiers. This wasn't their land, not their fight, not for the pay Shaw was offering. One of them grabbed the reins of the last steady horse, scooped up his wounded companion, and hauled him into the saddle. The third man provided covering fire, wild shots that kicked up dust and kept Elias's head down. Then they were gone, a frantic clattering retreat into the wilderness, leaving the stolen survey marker glinting in the sun, forgotten on a discarded saddle. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. Elias stayed behind his cover, reloading the Winchester, his eyes scanning the rocks. A trap could still be sprung, but there was only the wind and the fading sound of hoofbeats. He stepped out from behind the cactus, the rifle held at a low ready. The woman had not moved. She stood over the wounded man, the one Elias had shot, her knife at his throat. The man was pale, his face beaded with sweat. He stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. Elias walked forward slowly, his hands in plain sight. He stopped 20 feet away. He nodded toward the man on the ground. "Let him go," he said, his voice a low rasp. She stared at him, her dark eyes unreadable, trying to understand his part in this. She understood violence. She understood the predator and the prey. A stranger who fought for no reason was a dangerous unknown. He holstered his Colt and leaned the Winchester against a rock, a gesture of trust he hoped she would understand. "He's no more use to Shaw now," he said, his voice calm. She watched him for a long moment, then her gaze flickered to the cradle board, where the baby, disturbed by the gunfire, had begun to stir. Her choice was made. She stepped back from the wounded man, the immediate threat to her child having passed. The man, sobbing in a mixture of pain and relief, scrambled away, clutching his shoulder, and staggered off in the direction his companions had fled. Elias walked to the discarded saddle and untied the iron survey marker. He hefted its weight. $100 of trouble. He looked at the woman. She had not lowered her knife. Her bravery was a tangible thing, a shield around her and her child. He knew then that his journey had irrevocably changed course. He was no longer just a guide for hire. He was now a target. They traveled in a tense, watchful silence. The woman, who he learned was called Nita, though she never spoke the name, took the lead. She moved through the harsh landscape, not like someone fleeing it, but like someone who was a part of it. She found paths he would have missed, her bare feet leaving almost no trace on the hard, rocky ground. Elias followed a dozen paces behind, the heavy survey marker slung over his shoulder, his rifle in his hands. He was her rear guard. His presence was a truce, not an alliance, brokered by a shared enemy. She had the cradle board strapped to her back, and she moved with a steady, tireless rhythm. The baby was silent, rocked by the motion. Twice she stopped, kneeling to dig in the dry, sandy soil with her knife, unearthing a pale, tuberous root. She offered him one. He took it, chewing the tough, starchy flesh. It tasted of earth and survival. It was the first gesture of something other than suspicion that had passed between them. Their communication was a sparse, elemental language of gestures. A raised hand to signal a halt. A pointed finger at a distant dust cloud. A shake of the head at a brackish-looking waterhole. He was a master of reading terrain, but she was reading its soul. She knew which plants held water, which insects were edible, which caves would shelter them from the coming night's chill. Late in the afternoon, Elias called a halt. He held up his nearly empty canteen. Water, the most critical currency in this land. Nita scanned the horizon. Her eyes narrowed against the glare. She pointed to a distant line of dark, jagged peaks, a wound in the sky. She made a gesture of flowing water with her hands, then pointed to the setting sun and held up one finger. One day's walk. They did a silent peer check. His ammunition was down to 25 rounds for the Winchester, 12 for the Colt. They had a handful of roots and less than a quart of water between them. The horses he'd left tied in a hidden canyon were a half-day's ride in the wrong direction. They were on foot, exposed, and hunted. That night, they took shelter in a shallow cave, the rock still holding the day's warmth. Elias took the first watch, sitting at the mouth of the cave, the Winchester across his lap. The desert sky was a spill of cold, diamond-hard stars. He watched Nida tend to her baby, a boy with wide, curious eyes. Her movements were gentle, efficient, her humming a low, ancient lullaby that seemed to rise from the stones around them. He saw the object then. Tucked into the baby's swaddling was a small, intricately beaded leather pouch. Nida caught him looking, and her hand instantly covered it, her eyes flashing with a warning that needed no translation. It was important. More important than her own life, perhaps even the child's. This was not a simple flight for survival. She was a courier, carrying a message or an artifact of immense significance. And Colonel Shaw knew it. That's why he'd sent his men. Not just for a survey marker, not just for a random Apache woman, but for whatever she was protecting. The stakes of his simple job had just risen again. He was no longer just protecting a woman and her child. He was guarding a secret he didn't understand, from an enemy whose full power he had yet to see. The weight of the iron survey marker on the ground beside him felt heavier than before. It was a symbol of the law, of order. But out here, under the cold, indifferent stars, the only law was survival. And the only order was the one you made with the strength of your own hands and the speed of your own gun. The sun was a merciless anvil, beating down on the salt flats. The air shimmered, turning the distant mountains into wavering, ethereal ghosts. Every breath was a sip of fire. They had run out of water 2 hours ago. Elias could feel the dehydration setting in, the slight tremor in his hands, the dryness at the back of his throat. Nida seemed unaffected, her pace steady, her eyes fixed on the distant peaks. The child on her back was silent, shielded from the worst of the sun by a small, cleverly rigged piece of canvas. They found the ambush where the salt flats gave way to a maze of eroded sandstone canyons. It wasn't a place Elias would have chosen. Too open, but Shaw's tracker was good. A man named Coulter, ex-Army, who knew how the Apache thought. Coulter had anticipated they would seek the shade of the canyons. The trap was simple, a tripwire made of thin, almost invisible sinew, connected to a pile of rocks on the ledge above, designed to create a small rock slide. Not to kill, but to cripple, to pin them down. Elias saw it. A faint, unnatural line in the dust, a subtle disturbance that broke the natural pattern of the wind-swept ground. He threw out an arm, stopping Nida just as her foot was about to cross it. He pointed. She saw it instantly, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second. They backed away slowly, silently, melting back into the blinding glare of the flats. There was no way around. Coulter would be watching the canyon mouth from a high perch, a rifle resting in his hands. They were pinned down, with no cover and no water, the sun their most immediate enemy. Nida touched his arm, her gesture sharp, insistent. She pointed not forward, but sideways, toward a sheer rock face that seemed to offer no purchase. Then she pointed up. Climb. It was insane. The rock was 100 feet of vertical, sun-baked sandstone, with only the smallest cracks and ledges for holds. But as Elias studied it, he saw what she saw. A difficult, perilous, but possible route. It was a climber's route, not a walker's. Coulter would never expect it. He would be watching the canyon floor. They began the climb. Elias slung the heavy survey marker over his back, its weight a constant dragging anchor. The rifle was impossible to carry, so he strapped it tightly to his body, its barrel digging into his ribs. Nita went first, moving with an astonishing, instinctive grace. The cradle board seemed to be a part of her, its weight perfectly balanced. She was not just climbing. She was flowing up the rock, her fingers and toes finding holds that were nearly invisible. He followed, his larger, heavier body clumsy in comparison. The rock was hot to the touch, burning through the thin leather of his gloves. Sweat stung his eyes. His muscles screamed in protest. Halfway up, his foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel. He slid, his body scraping against the rough stone, the survey marker swinging wildly, threatening to pull him off the face. He managed to jam his hand into a deep crack, the rock tearing at his skin, his knuckles bloody. For a moment, he dangled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked up. Nita had stopped. She was watching him, her face impassive. She could have kept going, left him to his fate. He was a liability, but she waited. She didn't offer a hand. They were too far apart for that. She simply waited, a silent testament to their unspoken pact. If I fall, ride. Or in this case, climb. He found a new foothold, tested it, and began to move again, his body fueled by a surge of raw, stubborn will. They reached the top as the sun began to dip below the horizon, collapsing onto the flat mesa, their lungs burning. They had outsmarted Coulter. They were alive, but they were far from safe. They had lost precious time and energy. The mountains and the water they promised were still miles away. They found the mission at dawn, a crumbling adobe skeleton in the shadow of the peaks they had fought so hard to reach. An old well stood in the courtyard, its stone lip worn smooth by a century of rope and hands. Hope, sharp and desperate, surged through Elias. He lowered the bucket, his bloody hands trembling with anticipation. The splash from below was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. The water was cool and clean, tasting of stone and salvation. They drank deeply, refilling their canteens, the simple act of profound luxury. Nita gave water to the baby, whose silent endurance had been a miracle in itself. Elias found a name carved into the well stone. Jacobo. He remembered the man, a wiry, independent trader who worked the territory, a neutral party in the simmering conflict between the ranchers, the tribes, and Shaw. Jacobo's trading post was a day's ride from here. If they could get there, they could get horses, supplies. They could survive. As Nita tended to the baby in the shade of a collapsed archway, Elias scouted the mission's perimeter. His instincts, honed by years on the trail, were screaming. Something was wrong. The silence was too deep. There were no birds, no lizards skittering on the walls. He found the tracks on the north side of the mission, hidden in a dry wash. 6 riders. They had been here less than a day ago, and they hadn't left. He sprinted back to the courtyard, his hand on his Colt. Coulter, he breathed, the name a curse. It was a trap. Jacobo's mission wasn't a refuge. It was an anvil, and Coulter was the hammer. Just as the words left his lips, the mission bell, long thought silent, let out a single deafening clang. It was a signal. Men appeared on the ruined walls around them, rifles in their hands. Coulter stepped out from the chapel doorway, a smug, cruel smile on his face. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes the color of faded denim. "Thorne," he said, his voice a dry drawl. "I knew you were resourceful. Didn't figure you for a fool." Elias and Nita were trapped in the open courtyard, hopelessly outgunned. But before Coulter could give the order to fire, a new voice cut through the air, sharp and guttural. An Apache war cry. It came not from one throat, but from a dozen. Warriors rose from the rocks outside the mission, materializing from the landscape as if they were spirits of the land itself. They were armed with rifles and bows, their faces grim, their movements swift and silent. Coulter's trap had been sprung, but he was not the only hunter. A fierce, chaotic firefight erupted. Elias shoved Nita and the baby behind the relative safety of the well, using its thick stone wall as cover. He fired the Winchester, working the lever action, picking his targets with a cold, detached precision. He was no longer just a pathfinder. He was a soldier again. A warrior with a face of stone and eyes like flint stepped over the mission wall and landed beside him. He moved with the grace of a panther. "The woman, the child," he said in perfect, clipped English. "You have protected them." It wasn't a question. Elias nodded, chambering another round. "She leads well?" he replied. The warrior gave a curt nod of respect. "I am Cale. Nita is my sister." He looked Elias in the eye. "Colonel Shaw does not want land. He wants war. That pouch my sister carries. It is the treaty signature of our grandfather, Cochise's cousin. A peace treaty with the army, granting us the lands of the high peaks. Shaw aims to see that treaty burn, and our people with it. The unthinkable gift, it wasn't gold or horses. It was the truth. A truth that was heavier than any survey marker, more dangerous than any paid gun." Elias had stumbled into the heart of a private war, and by saving Nita, he had chosen a side. The warriors fought with a disciplined fury, quickly overwhelming Coulter's surprised men. Coulter himself, seeing the battle lost, made a break for the horses. But Cale was faster. A single arrow, loosed with blinding speed, took the tracker in the throat. He fell without a sound. In the sudden, bloody silence that followed, Cale retrieved the arrow. He walked back to Elias. The warriors had gathered, their expressions unreadable, as they looked at the white man who had fought beside them. "You have a debt from our people," Cale said. "But you have also earned an enemy. Shaw will not stop. He is moving a gun at Gatling to Sentinel Pass. He will slaughter the army delegation and my grandfather's party when they meet to sign the treaty in 2 days. He will make it look like our doing. He will have his war." Cale offered Elias a waterskin. "Your fight is done. You are free to go." Elias looked at Nita, who was holding her son, her face no longer fearful, but filled with a fierce pride. He looked at the warriors around him, men fighting for their homes, their families. He thought of the ghosts from his own past, of debts unpaid. He could walk away, but he knew he wouldn't. "Where is this pass?" Elias asked, his voice rough. Cale's lips curved into the barest hint of a smile. The pathfinder had chosen his trail. The Apache camp was a ghost, hidden so cleverly in a fold of the mountains that a man could ride within 100 yards and never know it was there. There were no campfires, only small smokeless pits. The wickiups blended seamlessly into the stands of pinyon and juniper. It was a place of quiet, disciplined life, a stark contrast to the brutal chaos of the frontier towns. Elias was an object of intense curiosity, a stranger in a world that had every reason to distrust him. But he was under Cale's protection, and Nita had told the story of his stand in the canyon. He was treated with a cool, formal respect. They gave him food roasted agave and venison jerky, and a warrior, a young man with old eyes, tended to the wounds on his hands with a poultice of herbs that stung, but immediately began to soothe the raw flesh. He sat with Cale by a small hidden spring as Nita joined them, her son now sleeping soundly in the cradleboard propped against a rock. The treaty pouch lay on the ground between them. Shaw was a colonel in the volunteers, Cale explained, his voice a low murmur that did not disturb the stillness of the evening. He believes this land was promised to his men, to his vision. He sees us, the treaty, as a betrayal of that promise. He is not a man of law. He is a man of conquest. The Gatling gun, Elias said, his mind focused on the tactical problem. Where did he get it? Stolen from an army shipment a month ago, Cale replied. He has a fortified position at the head of Sentinel Pass, the old Fort Jericho. From there, he commands the only approach to the meeting ground. When the delegations arrive, he will turn the pass into a killing floor. Nita spoke then, her voice soft but strong, addressing Cale in their own tongue. He listened intently, then turned back to Elias. My sister says she knows the fort. Our people were held there, long ago. She remembers a way in. A water culvert on the blind side of the mountain where the spring runoff flows. It is small, hidden by scree and brush. The soldiers never used it. A plan began to form, a desperate, high-stakes gamble. It was a classic infiltration, relying on stealth and surprise. Cale's warriors could create a diversion on the far side of the pass, drawing the attention of the main force. A smaller team could use the culvert to get inside the fort and disable the gun. It was a mission for a small, specialized unit, a suicide mission. Your men are warriors, not ghosts, Elias said, thinking aloud. They're trained for the open field, for the ambush. This requires a different skill. You need someone who knows how soldiers think, how a fort is laid out. Cale's eyes met his. The unspoken offer hung in the air. This was Elias's world. He was an ex-cavalry scout, a man who had spent years inside forts exactly like Jericho. He knew their rhythms, their blind spots, their vulnerabilities. I will lead the team, Elias said. It was not a boast, but a statement of fact. But I need one of your people with me, someone who knows the culvert, someone who can move in silence. He looked at Nita. She had already known. Her hand rested on her son's cradleboard, but her eyes were on the dark silhouette of Fort Jericho miles away. Her motivation was the most powerful in the world. She would not be sidelined. Cale was reluctant. To risk his sister, the bearer of the treaty pouch, was unthinkable. But he looked at her face, at the unyielding resolve in her eyes, and he knew he had no choice. Agency was a warrior's right, regardless of gender. It will be you too, Cale said finally, his voice heavy. And two of my best hunters, Chaco and Taz. You will go in at moonset. You will disable the gun. My warriors will be in position to attack at dawn. If you fail, we will all be slaughtered. The ticking clock was now wound tight. They had less than 12 hours. Elias stood, his body aching but his mind sharp, clear. He performed a mental gear check. He had his life, a half-full canteen, and a mission only he could complete. The debt from his past was a distant echo. The duty of the present was all that mattered. Fort Jericho was a jagged crown of rock and timber perched at the mouth of Sentinel Pass. It was a place built to dominate, to project power. Floodlights, a recent and expensive addition by Shaw, lit up the main gate and the walls, creating stark pools of white in the inky blackness. The pass itself was a deep, narrow scar through the mountains, a natural choke point. The Gatling gun, positioned in a stone blockhouse overlooking the approach, would be able to command every inch of it. There would be no escape for anyone caught in its field of fire. Elias, Nita, and the two Apache hunters, Chaco and Taz, lay on a ridge a half-mile away, studying the fortress. Cale's main force was miles away on the other side of the pass, preparing their diversion. This small team was alone. The lights are powered by a generator, Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. It will be in the old quartermaster's building. Loud. It will cover sound, but the guards will be alert. He was back in his element, the cold, calculating mind of a scout taking over. He noted the patrol patterns, the placement of the sentries on the walls. Shaw was running the fort with military discipline. Nita pointed to the dark, shadowed cliff face on the western side, away from the lights and the main gate. The culvert is there, she whispered, her English surprisingly clear, saved for when it was most needed. At the base of the rock slide, they moved like shadows, using the terrain for cover, the two Apache hunters seeming to glide over the loose rock without making a sound. Elias, despite his weariness, moved with a familiar, practiced stealth. They reached the base of the cliff, the generator's rhythmic chugging a low, constant thrum in the air. Nita found the entrance to the culvert hidden behind a thick curtain of overgrown brush. It was a black, uninviting hole, barely 3 feet high, smelling of damp earth and decay. Chaco went in first, a snake slithering into its den. Nita followed, then Elias, and finally Taz. The passage was tight, claustrophobic. Water trickled over the stone floor, soaking the knees of their trousers. They crawled in utter darkness, the only sound their own breathing and the scrape of their bodies against the rock. After 50 yards, the tunnel opened up slightly, and a faint gray light filtered down from a grated opening above. They were inside the fort's perimeter. Nita pointed up. Elias put his eye to the grate. They were in a drainage ditch at the back of the stables. He could see 2 guards, their backs to them, sharing a cigarette at the far end of the compound. The blockhouse containing the Gatling gun was a squat, formidable stone building 100 yards away across an open parade ground. Getting to it would be the most dangerous part of the mission. They waited, every muscle tensed, for the guards to move on. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, one of the guards stubbled out his cigarette, and they began their patrol, their route taking them away from the stables. Now, Elias breathed. They slipped out of the drainage ditch one by one, melting into the deep shadows cast by the stable wall. They moved in short, silent bursts, from one patch of darkness to the next, their timing synchronized with the passing of the sentries on the wall above. It was a deadly ballet of shadow and light. They reached the side of the blockhouse. The door was thick oak, reinforced with iron straps, and certainly locked. A single barred window was set high in the stone wall, too high to reach without making a noise. Taz, the younger of the 2 hunters, uncoiled a thin, strong rope from his belt. He pointed to a timber strut supporting the blockhouse roof. Chaco, the stronger of the 2, braced himself. In a single, fluid motion, Taz ran, launched himself off Chaco's clasped hands, and caught the strut. He swung his body up, silent as an owl, and perched on the beam. He secured the rope, letting it fall to the ground. Elias was the first one up, his worn boots finding purchase on the rough stone wall. He peered through the window. One man sat inside, leaning back in a chair, a magazine in his lap, the Gatling gun, a monstrous multi-barreled beast of brass and steel beside him. Just as Elias was about to signal the all clear, the door to the blockhouse opened. A second guard entered, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The plan had just gone sideways. There were 2 of them now. A silent takedown was impossible. The 2 guards inside the blockhouse presented a fatal problem. Disabling them without raising an alarm seemed impossible. As Elias clung to the rope, his mind raced through a dozen failed scenarios. A gunshot was out of the question. A thrown knife was too risky. They were stuck. It was Nita who saw the solution. Her eyes weren't on the guards, but on the blockhouse itself. She pointed to the roof, then made a gesture of something small and heavy falling. Elias looked up. The roof was flat, made of thick timber, covered with a layer of sod for insulation and camouflage. A small stone chimney rose from the center, venting a simple iron stove used for heat on cold nights. He understood instantly. Chaco, the quiet hunter, produced a small leather pouch from his belt. He opened it to reveal a fine, dark powder. A potent sleeping powder derived from a rare desert root. A weapon of silence. The new plan was formed in a series of swift, urgent gestures. Taz, still perched on the roof beam, swung himself up and onto the roof itself, moving with a ghost silence. Chaco tied the pouch to the end of the rope, and Elias hauled it up, passing it to Taz. On the ground, Nita and Chaco gathered a handful of small pebbles from the parade ground. This was all about timing. Nita gave a low, piercing bird call, a sound so natural in the night that it wouldn't raise suspicion. At the signal, Chaco threw a pebble against the far wall of the fort. Inside the blockhouse, the two guards stirred, looking toward the door. "Hear that?" one asked. "Probably just the generator skipping," the other replied, uninterested. A second bird call from Nita. Chaco threw another pebble, this time closer, against the corner of the nearby barracks. This time, both guards stood up, their curiosity piqued. One of them walked to the door and peered out into the darkness. "Don't see nothin'," he grumbled. While he was distracted, Taz, lying flat on the roof, crept to the chimney. He carefully emptied the contents of the pouch down the flue. The fine powder drifted down, invisible in the dim lantern light, and settled into the warm air rising from the stove. The guard closed the door, shaking his head. "Wind's kicking up," he said, returning to his chair. They sat in a small, enclosed space, breathing in the drugged air. Elias and the others waited, their patience absolute. It took 3 minutes. First, one of the guards yawned, his head slumping forward. The magazine slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. The second guard chuckled, and his own eyes grew heavy. His head fell back against the wall, and a soft snore escaped his lips. The blockhouse was neutralized. They entered through the window, lowering themselves quietly to the floor. The Gatling gun was even more imposing up close. It was bolted to a heavy iron tripod, its barrels aimed out a large firing slit that commanded the pass. Disabling it was the next hurdle. Elias examined the weapon. He could remove the firing pin, but a skilled armorer could replace it in minutes. He could jam the crank mechanism, but it could be cleared. They needed a more permanent solution. Chaco had the answer. He produced a set of small, finely crafted stone wedges and a leather-wrapped mallet. It was a tool for splitting rock, but here it would serve another purpose. While Elias stood guard at the door, Chaco and Taz worked with a quiet, focused intensity. They inserted the thin wedges into the delicate gears of the traversing mechanism, the part that allowed the gun to sweep from side to side. Then, with a series of muffled, carefully placed taps from the mallet, they drove the wedges deep into the gear train. The sound was minimal, lost beneath the thrum of the generator. The soft metal of the brass gears gave way, twisting and breaking. The Gatling gun was now locked in place, unable to move, its field of fire reduced to a single useless narrow line. The objective was complete. As they prepared to leave, a sound from outside froze them in their tracks. The heavy tread of boots on the gravel parade ground. A patrol, coming early. There was no time to get back out the window. They were trapped inside the blockhouse with 2 unconscious guards and a broken superweapon. The footsteps stopped directly outside the blockhouse door. A fist hammered against the thick oak. "Miller, Jackson, you awake in there?" A voice barked. Elias, Nita, and the 2 hunters pressed themselves into the darkest corners of the room, their weapons ready. The sleeping guards were their biggest liability. If the patrol came inside, the ruse was over. Elias held up a hand, signaling for silence. He moved to the door, his Colt steady in his hand. He pitched his voice low, making it rough and sleepy. "Yeah, we're here," he grumbled. "What's the problem?" "Coulter's overdue from his scout," the voice on the other side said. "Colonel's getting twitchy. Wants a full report. Open up." It was a direct order. To refuse would be to confirm suspicion. Elias looked at Nita. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. The plan had failed. Now it was about survival. He was about to kick the door open and start shooting when Nita held up a hand, her expression calm and fiercely intelligent. She pointed to a stack of empty ammunition crates in the corner, then to the unconscious guards. Her meaning was clear. Hide them. It was a desperate gamble. Chaco and Taz moved with lightning speed, dragging the two heavy, limp bodies behind the crates, arranging them in a heap. Nita quickly tidied the chairs, kicking the fallen magazine under the table. It was a flimsy deception, but it might buy them a few precious seconds. Elias took a deep breath. "Doors barred?" he called out. "Gimme a second." He made a series of loud scraping noises, mimicking the sound of a heavy iron bar being lifted. Then he cracked the door open just a few inches, his body blocking the view of the interior. A hard-faced man in a dusty coat stood outside, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "What's the report?" the man demanded, trying to peer past Elias. "All quiet," Elias said, his voice flat. "Generators running rough, but the pass is clear. Saw a coyote about an hour back." "That's it." The man's eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize Elias, but in the dark, with dozens of new guns in camp, that wasn't unusual. Still, he was suspicious. "Why's it smell like a damn herb garden in there?" he asked, sniffing the air. "Stove smoking," Elias said without missing a beat. "Been fighting with it all night." He made his posture bored, irritated, a man bothered on a long, dull watch. The performance was flawless. The guard hesitated, his instincts warring with his logic. From the far side of the fort, a single gunshot cracked the night. Cale's diversion. It had started early. The guard's head snapped in that direction. What the hell was that? He forgot about the stove, about the strange face in the doorway. A larger threat was imminent. "Go," Elias hissed, shoving the door closed and barring it for real this time. The guard, his attention now fully on the source of the gunshot, ran toward the main gate, shouting for the captain of the watch. The diversion had saved them. They slipped back out the window, leaving the two guards to their drugged sleep. But their objective had changed. Disabling the gun was no longer enough. Shaw was alerted. He would have the gun fixed or bring in another. They had to deny him the pass itself. Elias looked at the sheer rock walls of the canyon, then at a small shed near the blockhouse, its door marked with a stark skull and crossbones warning. "Dynamite. New plan," he said to Nita, his voice grim. "We're not breaking the gun. We're closing the road." He was no longer just a scout. He was a sapper, and he was about to bring the mountain down. The dynamite shed was locked with a heavy padlock. Chaco, using a thin, hardened piece of metal he carried for just such a purpose, worked the lock with a surgeon's delicacy. It sprang open with a soft click. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of chemicals. Crates of dynamite were stacked against the far wall, along with coils of fuse and boxes of blasting caps. It was Shaw's tool for clearing rockfalls, a way to keep his path to conquest open. Elias was about to turn it into a dead end. They worked with a frantic, focused urgency. Chaco and Taz, with their innate understanding of rock and stress points, identified the key weaknesses in the cliff face overlooking the pass. A series of small charges, placed correctly, would be more effective than one large, random blast. They needed to create a cascade, a surgical rock slide that would seal the canyon completely. Nita stood watch, her eyes scanning the now chaotic fort. Men were running toward the south wall, where Cale's warriors were creating a symphony of harassing fire, drawing Shaw's forces away from the pass. It was a masterful diversion, but it wouldn't last forever. Elias cut the fuses, his hand surprisingly steady. He crimped the blasting caps into place, his movements precise and economical. Every action was stripped of waste. They were a perfect team, 4 individuals from different worlds, united by a single desperate purpose. They placed the charges, working their way up the side of the pass, jamming the dynamite sticks into deep fissures in the rock. As Elias set the last charge, a figure appeared on the path below them. It was Colonel Gideon Shaw himself, flanked by 2 of his personal guards. He hadn't been drawn away by the diversion. He was a true commander, moving toward the most critical strategic point on the battlefield, the Gatling gun. He saw them. For a moment, he simply stared, his cold, intelligent eyes taking in the scene, the figures on the cliff, the telltale gleam of the fuses. His face, illuminated by the distant floodlights, registered not shock, but a kind of weary, frustrated anger. The anger of a master strategist whose perfectly laid plans were being undone by a handful of gnats. "You," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. It was directed at Elias, the pathfinder. I should have known Coulter failed. He raised his pistol, a heavy, long-barreled dragoon revolver. Get down from there. Now, his guards raised their rifles. Chaco and Taz knocked arrows to their bows, the movement a silent, fluid reflex. Nita drew her knife, her body tensed. "It's over, Shaw," Elias called down, his voice echoing in the narrow pass. "Your war ends here." "This is not a war," Shaw replied, his voice dangerously calm. "This is pest control." He fired. The shot wasn't aimed at Elias, but at the fuse dangling near his hand. The bullet sparked against the rock, missing by inches. Elias didn't flinch. He took a burning stick of slow match he'd prepared from his belt. He had one last choice to make. He could light the main fuse, the one that would trigger the entire cascade, but its length would give Shaw and his men time to get clear. Or he could light the short fuse on the charge right beside him, guaranteeing the slide would start, but trapping himself on the ledge. He looked down at Nita. He saw the pleading in her eyes. Don't do it. He thought of the debt he could never repay, the ghost that rode with him. He thought of this woman, this child, this people who had trusted him. No one gets left behind. But sometimes one man stays. He touched the slow match to the short fuse. It sputtered, caught, and began to hiss, a snake of fire eating its way toward the dynamite. Get out. He yelled to Nita and the others. Go. The hiss of the fuse was the only sound in the world. For a frozen second, everyone stared at the tiny, inexorable spark. Then the tableau shattered. Chaco and Taz fired their arrows in perfect unison. One of Shaw's guards grunted and fell, an arrow protruding from his chest. The other fired his rifle wildly as he dove for cover. Nita did not run. She grabbed a coil of rope they had used for the climb, looped one end around a solid rock outcrop with a speed born of desperation, and threw the other end up toward Elias. "Catch!" she screamed, her voice raw. The rope landed just short. Elias was out of reach. Shaw, his face a mask of cold fury, ignored his fallen man and took careful aim at Elias. He was a dead man. But from the shadows below, a figure rose up. Cale. He had not stayed with the diversion. Like Shaw, he knew where the real battle would be. He slammed into Shaw from the side, a silent, brutal tackle that sent both men sprawling. Shaw's shot going wide, splintering the rock above Elias's head. The fuse hissed, impossibly loud. Elias knew he had only seconds. He looked down at the battle raging below Cale, and Shaw locked in a desperate struggle, knives glinting in the dim light. He saw Nita, Chaco, and Taz providing covering fire, holding off the remaining guard. He had a choice. He could jump, a 50-foot drop onto jagged rock. He might survive, but he would be broken. Or he could see this through. He grabbed the dynamite charge he had just lit. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he ripped it from the fissure. It was an act of pure, suicidal madness. The fuse was burning down to its last inch. He pivoted and threw the lit charge not down into the pass, but sideways into a deep, unstable crevice at the base of a massive rock pillar that loomed over the entire scene. It was a masterstroke of tactical improvisation, a pathfinder reading the terrain one last time. The dynamite exploded with a deafening, gut-punching roar. The pillar, its base shattered, groaned like a dying behemoth. It began to topple, not into the pass, but directly onto the blockhouse, and the fort's main gate. Elias was thrown from the ledge by the force of the blast, his body cartwheeling through the air. He landed in a deep pile of loose scree and gravel, the impact jarring every bone in his body, and then darkness claimed him. The aftermath was a scene of apocalyptic destruction. The massive rock pillar had crashed down, completely demolishing the blockhouse and the Gatling gun within. It had also sealed the main gate of the fort, trapping Shaw's men inside their own fortress. The secondary charges, their fuses severed by the rockfall, never detonated. The pass was blocked, but not permanently. The way was closed. Shaw's plan was in ruins. His men were trapped. Cale stood over the stunned and bleeding form of the colonel, his knife at the man's throat. The fight was over. The cost was tallied. Debts were settled. Nita scrambled up the scree slope, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She found Elias half buried in the rubble, unconscious, bleeding from a dozen cuts, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. But he was breathing. The pathfinder, who had been ready to sacrifice himself, had survived. The sun rose on a changed world. The cavalry patrol, arriving for the treaty signing, found not a peaceful delegation, but the ruins of a private army and a blocked pass. Shaw, disarmed and bound, was handed over, his dreams of conquest ending in the dust of Fort Jericho. The testimony of the soldiers he had hired, coupled with the evidence of the Gatling gun and the Apache warrior's account, sealed his fate. The law, slow and often absent in the territory, had finally arrived. They found a new way around the rockslide, a treacherous game trail that Cale's people had known for generations. Elias was carried back to the Apache camp on a makeshift litter. For days he hovered in a world of fever and pain. Nita and the tribe's healer tended to him, setting his broken arm, cleaning his wounds with ancient remedies that smelled of sage and pine. He woke to the sound of Nita humming the same low lullaby he had heard in the cave. She was sitting by his side, mending a tear in his shirt with a bone needle, her son sleeping peacefully beside her. He saw that the intricate pouch was no longer tucked into the cradleboard. It was on a table nearby, its purpose served, the treaty it represented now secure. "Cale?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper. "He is with our grandfather," Nita said, a small smile touching her lips. "The treaty is signed. The army has pledged to honor it. The fighting is done. He had won. They had all won. He had repaid a debt he never knew he owed, silencing the ghosts that had ridden with him for so long. He had found something he hadn't even been looking for, a purpose beyond mere survival." A few weeks later, when he was strong enough to walk, Cale came to him. He led Elias to the crest of a hill overlooking the valley, the high peaks a majestic, protective wall around it. "This land is ours now," Cale said. "A home, a place of peace." He turned to Elias. "You have a place here, if you wish it. You are no longer a stranger." It was the highest honor they could bestow, an offer to join their people, to leave his old life behind. He was tempted. He looked at the quiet, ordered life of the camp, at Nida and her son, at the profound peace of the valley. But he knew, in his heart, that he was a man of the trail. The silence of the open prairie, the challenge of the next horizon, was woven into the fabric of his soul. He had been transformed by his journey, but he had not been remade. He shook his head, a gesture of gratitude, not refusal. "My path lies elsewhere," he said. Cale nodded, understanding. "Then you will not ride it empty-handed." The next day, the warriors brought him the gift. It was not gold from some hidden mine, or a string of the finest horses. It was something far more valuable. They brought him his own rifle, cleaned and oiled, his Colt, its cylinder full, a new saddle, its leather supple and strong, and Coulter's horse, a magnificent black gelding, the best mount in Shaw's remuda. They were giving him back his life, his identity as a pathfinder, but it was an identity renewed, reforged. He was still Elias Thorne, a man who read the land. But now, he was also the man who fought for the helpless, the man who had brought down a mountain to protect a people not his own. He mounted the gelding, the horse shifting under his weight, eager to run. He looked at Nita one last time. No words were needed. The bond between them was forged in fire and shadow. A debt of life that could never be repaid, only honored. He turned the horse and rode out of the valley, not looking back. The land was the same, a harsh and beautiful wilderness, but the hero was not. He rode on, a solitary figure against the vast horizon, no longer isolated, but connected, a man who had finally found his own true trail.